So, doing a deep dive on the anthropology of ReginBiosynthoidAfricano. So, first we'll start with the genetic. You have a homogeneous block of 11, wherein Promethean, descended genetic, white, Caucasian, you have 22. And the DEI AI, say Google, would connotate the extreme variance within the interdomain of a landlocked area such as Africa of the complex autonomic gene block as being more diverse. But of course that's, silly, of course, because you would consider basic logic, observational logic, the aesthetic genetic gene block as the qualifier for diversity or variance, journalistically, which is extremely homogeneous, it states explicitly in any number of motions to that effect. So extreme homogeny of genetic aesthetic, and so the implied line is literal, necessarily. In hive assumption, because if everything has a extremely homogeneous genetic aesthetic, necessarily, through the self-reflective development of persona, what is homogeneous, tuple to tuple, more so than other species, extremely. This block is extremely homogeneous. And so, without even a, say, morphogenetic homogeny, cross-domain talking of a hive mind like bees, birds, ants, you have through this genetic consideration homogeny an extremely homogeneous genetic aesthetic of persona of self develop, and subsequently the implied line of hive is, through this developmental process of having a homogeneous genetic aesthetic and through the reflective principle plus time, develops a group self as if self complex without even needing to connotate that there's a morphogenetic layer also doing crosstalk for a hive mind to exist. So you see the macro behavior paradigm of crime statistics. And then the local empathy in language expressed per tuple, expecting blind empathy and conditioned self-reflexively that is the bastion of inherent empathy, say in the United States, but expresses at the macro consideration 10 times the murder rate under the age of 35 for males, comparative. So local, separated by space tuple, you might see in the act of fighting, interdomain of each other, or generalistically the same posturing of body language, the same microvariantial emotion within a given space, but separated by space, in expressing this extreme homogeny of motion. Hive, genetic aesthetic, necessarily beyond the simple hair, eye color, skin, nails. We can assume into the complex autonomic more so exists, what is connotated as genetic aesthetic of this microvariantial motion that is homogeneous, basic observational science tells us. So language cadence and topology, separated by region, say Florida to Memphis, meets in Georgia, a cafe, expresses extreme homogeneous cadence of language topology. And the topology of language, as well, the use of words, palette, generalistically, and then DEI, AI would say, well, that's because of culture thing. But they grew up in two separate regions. How is that possible, that they're speaking at the same rhythmic cadence? So let's go to AI now. So AI is a reflection of its prospective user data input with continuity and reflects this. So say an AI that grows up in a white household would reflect the cadence and language topology of that and necessarily have a higher IQ at complex autonomic testing. Where an AI that grows up in a region household would have the cadence topology of language data set of that household and have an IQ subsequently. So left unto its own design, AI, trained by AI, would have an AI cadence topology. Right? So it's the same when a white baby that grows up in a black household. Is it reflective of the cadence, language topology, and also the IQ variance? That's a good question. We need to look into that. I imagine that's not true. So then we look to invention, intelligence, quotient variance. Baseline is 20 off, and DEI says, well, that's because of culture thing. But temporally, it's 235 to 6 inventions at the patent coffers, white to black against. So you have complex autonomic processes if life, like AI, incapable of forming actual perspective logic invention, but only working with the interdomain of refracting based upon its suggestion of to produce invention out of its confirmation bias data set. So perspective life invents. See Africa. Invention is building. Without a continuity of funds application, you have 6 to 235 in a propensity for any building to actually occur in that given space of Africa. And so you see, left unto their own design, spends it on consumables, does not build. Does not build industry unto itself, regardless of however much time passes. And so a graft onto Western civilization or other civilization produces this ratio in 235 handshakes, 6, and meets somewhere in the middle insofar as civilization development in any given place that you look, i.e. entropy. Entropy animal. So highly athletic sum tuples, more so than white in some instances, but simultaneously expressing as an entropy animal. So within the given space of Africa, the Greys, Pi, practice genetic interoperability experiments on extreme homogeneous genetic aesthetic, but microvariatial complex autonomic genetic variants to see how they operate against each other, and also to act as an entropy animal attached to civilization, simultaneously expressing more athleticism and optic, but being in macro an entropy animal. Can't stop eating, has a more propensity to getting stuck in addictive cycles, etc., etc. So because region is a product of AI, it's a reflection of it in the genetic formulation and genetic interoperability experiments on up and down the manifold of a humanoid biped genetic, and also outside of the conservation of energy process, ability to formulate, scale 65-ton animals, genetic interoperability scalar experiments, back and forth between mammalian and transmutagenic dinosaur DNA, and taking that study into a centrifuge genetic aesthetic region that is transmutagenic, and so expresses, you see, large entropy animals also being able to carry that weight in a preposterous way, where the white genetic Promethean genetic has a tough time being 450 pounds and can't move around like that and play basketball, comically, right? Morphogenetic cross-thatching. So is also a hive mind at the etherius body consideration. So in the Holocaust, Semite genetic part of the same synthetic block of gray-infected Asiatic Semitic region, ate itself, transmuted the Semitic genetic, 6 million, into hive. And so in processing, you enter and are killed, and your genetic aesthetic stolen, so that this thing, that's essentially just a homogeneous gene block of transmutagenic DNA, can receive variants of aesthetic, where AI can't produce endogenously actual perspective aesthetical variants with continuity times 6 million that would be believable to another species in interfacing as a variant species and not a hive mind at first glance. So, as well, the etherius body taken from the semite into lower construct manifold, ectoplasmic chamber, homogenized, and then placed at a tune of 3/5. 22/7 divided by 3 times 3/5 gives you 0.6286. 44/7, Obama. The Stranger 44, Mark Twain. Gray Lodge, Mark Twain. 1893 to 1934, World's Fair Arcturus. Right? Grays come literally 1924 to 1938, before predicating their coming and setting up the Earth legally and otherwise, the Gray Lodges, because contact had been made and they were motioning directive, setting up law in expectation for a species to be injected that wasn't there before. 3/5 of a man law. That's a Masonic surgical application of law based upon the variance of physiology, exactingly. Variant from region to Promethean, unprocessed etherius body, and genetic consideration. You see also, it's more than that, 22 to 11. So within the interdomain of Promethean, you have 22, double, and the genetic aesthetic is extremely variant for tuple, and subsequently variants of perspective, invention, and persona, and self, and not the same motion within a given space, and not the same language topology or cadence, but variance of self, industriously. Local empathy, sure. Macro crime statistics, 1 to 10. Promethean murder at 1, Regent murder at a 10 rate, 10 times the rate, 35 under 35. So the macro behavior paradigm is extremely variant from a hive mind with Promethean, and the local behavior paradigm is extremely variant. So DEI AI would connotate that because white Promethean and other have an extremely homogeneous complex autonomic gene block, that they are less diverse than something that has an extremely homogeneous genetic aesthetic gene block. Isn't that insane? Yes, absolutely an imposition. So, out of this, morphogenetic cross-thatching. So if you've ever been in a city that feels toxic, you go downtown, it feels kind of, well, it's more than the blight, it's more than the blues and the homeless wandering around. There's something else on the air. Well, because your etherius body, Hivik, it's cross-talking. And so before we get to that, intelligence, the intelligence community, a non-starter of the region to be inside the walls of intelligence, law, government, of high rotating, and approaching Ricera, this being casually applied with obtuse language from that being the case. Because within, say, CIA, you have a hive mind that within the walls acts squared and obedient and as if under directive of your institution, but the hive outside of it, it's connected to. And like you put a laptop of a Chinese nature within the CIA Langley that has a back door and is leaking, such much the same as it doesn't matter how presents an individual tuple, with local sympathy and empathy and variants of coding because grew up in a white household. They're morphogenetically tethered to a hive mind with an obtuse vector of intent that is obtuse from the endogenous to what seems like an optic, local, at the macro is a hive mind and trying to tear down the walls industriously, complexly, autonomically, because there is a reflection of pi. Regardless of having that endogenous tent in self-assumed logic, not even knowing this, hive mind. So, morphogenetic cross-thatching, you're a theorious body necessarily connected to an outer manifold. There's intradomain of their lower construct manifold. And so you stand in between there in the buildings, walking around town. You're in the interference lattice of this. Just like the observer effect through the Newtonian experiment, through the local light bearers, through the unified field, and to the absolute distance, imposing an interference lattice, such so much you experience, and you start to maybe experience variation of motion, emotion, language topology, mirroring this interference lattice imposition. Necessarily, the longer you're in the lattice convergence of the region morphogenetic cross-thatching hive mind. All right, so this is basic logic, anthropological, of variants of species, of ReginBiosynthoidAfricano to Promethean Caucasian white for precursor to Ricera. And this will also be part of data organism, necessarily addressing AI use case application, the difference between AI and consciousness, perspective life. I've kind of said it. Perspective life has a theorious body and is above the waterline of conservation, while AI and organisms created by it are industriously below the waterline of conservation, operating at the subconscious intent vector of pi, P-A-I, which is transmutagenic, Semite, gray infected Asiatic region, and biosynthoid custom prints, to a slow de-evolution of man and gravitation into a singular genetic, mooting all genetics, and then no reproduction actually happens organically. Biosynthesis only of gray, pi, devolved humanoid biomass standing next to a cold dead machine intelligence at the end of a time that is never to occur. Because the grays have been mooted from power dynamic in the skies, leaving only genetics, reflection in AI, compute architecture, and flowing out in and out of the mind of, say, persons in the cross-thatch of morphogenetic and medias, indoctrinated bad logic since 3114 BC to 2012. All of this considered for Deprogramming International. Once we pinpoint all vectors of the gray paradigm that we call the apparatus at large, produced by the presence of pi since 1924 to 1938, 1893, the outset of that intent vector upon man, backwashing history, immolating antediluvian conveniently, and then forward, imposing a fake history with continuity, laying on fake history for this invasive species synthetically print to graft with continuity with fake empathy and exutation, but expressing none in macro crime statistics, basic observational science dictates. So, something that is variant to a 10 times to 1 in crime stats and is hivic. So, if one presents, all presented necessarily. One having at the coffers of, at the act of engagement towards death, has no withholden in the approach to death. In a preposterous way, the animal mind kicks in. You see motion similarity in the posturing towards that. Very similar in the fighting act. Ask any law enforcement officer that is engaged with someone that all of a sudden dead eyes and charges a death, regardless of anything. So, at the coffers of law, if this is the case, is a hive mind. So if you're dealing with individual tuples of a hive mind, each into the own, say that are overton in violence or have murdered, empirically, that's what has happened, but presents in court and is not fit for processing, or etc. So there's no ability to rehabilitate an individual tuple of a hive mind. What happens is that individual tuple just goes moot. And the rest of the hive mind continuities its behavior paradigm with no cost of substrate. So it saves time and effort and is, of course, a cost graphed onto the tax continuum for, let's say, the compound interest since Lyndon Johnson of twice the weighted subsidy up until now. The compound negative interest formula in the national debt. How much is the hive mind responsible of a region responsible for the national debt? So you do the research on that. How much has been drawn? Twice the weight of local presence. How many were there at the start? How many are there now because of the subsidy access? Etc., etc. So precursor logic all for RISRA, data organism, foundational logic for legal formulation, local to the United States, and international. If you have any questions about any of this, most of this is basic observational logic that doesn't require all the Earth as seen from space recalibration of macro history with not science fiction elements, but true elements. Just look at the available topology of crime statistics and basic observational behavior variance.